Have you ever watched the woman who gave birth to you swear under oath that you are mentally unstable, just so she can swallow the inheritance you spent your youth protecting my mother? Victoria thinks my silence is a breakdown. She believes this trial is my end. She does not realize this courtroom is actually a crime scene I have been staging for 3 years, waiting for her to speak the final word that seals her own indictment. My name is Cassandra Hawthorne, and at this exact moment, I am the villain in a tragedy written, directed, and starring the woman weeping in the witness stand. The air in the courtroom of the New York Supreme Court tasted of floor wax, stale coffee, and the specific metallic tang of lies. It was a suffocating atmosphere, the kind that pressed against your chest and made your lungs work double time just to draw a breath. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded loosely in my lap, watching my mother, Victoria Hawthorne, dab at her dry eyes with a silk Hermes handkerchief. It was a vintage piece, the pattern a chaotic swirl of gold and crimson that likely cost more than my court-appointed lawyer made in a week. "She is not herself, Your Honor," Victoria said, her voice cracking with a practiced fragility that would have garnered a standing ovation on Broadway. She clutched the railing of the witness box, her knuckles white, her posture slumped just enough to suggest a mother carrying the weight of the world. My Cassandra. She used to be so bright, but now she sees shadows where there is only light. She creates enemies out of thin air. I watched her performance with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a specimen under a slide. Victoria looked immaculate, of course. She was wearing a charcoal wool suit that screamed understated power. Her platinum hair coiffed into a severe yet elegant bob, every inch of her projected stability, competence, and heartbroken maternal concern. In contrast, I looked like a wreck. I could feel the heavy gaze of Judge Vance bearing down on me. He was a stern man with thick gray eyebrows and a face etched with the cynicism of someone who had heard every excuse in the city. He looked from my mother's polished grief to me, and I knew exactly what he saw. He saw a woman of 32 years with greasy, unkempt hair pulled back into a messy bun. He saw the oversized, moth-eaten gray sweater that swallowed my frame, making me look smaller, frailer. He saw the dark circles under my eyes which were real, though not for the reasons he thought, and the way I stared blankly at the mahogany table. "Can you elaborate on this behavior, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Judge Vance asked, his voice gentle, deferential to the sobbing CEO. Victoria sniffed, dabbing the silk against her nose. "She is paranoid, Your Honor. She lives in a hovel in the Bronx, completely isolated. She refuses to see family. When I try to visit, she won't open the door. I hear her inside, muttering. She talks to herself for hours, screaming about numbers, about codes, about people watching her through the walls." I kept my face entirely slack. The Grey Rock method. Be uninteresting, be unresponsive, be a rock that the narcissist eventually loses interest in kicking. I focused on the rhythmic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. 62 beats per minute. I was not screaming about people watching me through the walls. I was, in fact, usually dictating complex encryption algorithms to my voice-to-text software while pacing my apartment, or conducting penetration tests on firewall systems for defense contractors. The muttering, Victoria heard, was likely me negotiating a contract with a client in Zurich over an encrypted line. But the truth was complicated, and the lie was simple. "And employment?" the judge asked. "None," Victoria whispered, the word hanging in the air like a sentence. "She has not held a real job in 5 years. She calls herself an artist. But, Your Honor, she just paints black circles on canvas and claims they are worth thousands. No one buys them. She is destitute." Beside Victoria stood her lawyer, Sterling. He was a man who looked like he had been dipped in oil and rolled in expensive cologne. He stepped forward, smoothing his tie, a shark sensing blood in the water. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice oily and smooth, "if I may approach the bench, we have submitted an independent psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Arrington. I did not flinch, though a spark of anger flared in my gut before I extinguished it. Dr. Arrington, the man who had a gambling debt in Atlantic City that miraculously vanished 3 weeks ago, right around the time Victoria hired him. The report is conclusive, Sterling continued, handing a thick folder to the bailiff to pass to the judge. Miss Hawthorne is suffering from acute bipolar disorder with schizophrenic tendencies. She is a danger to her own financial well-being. The manic episodes are characterized by grandiose delusions of persecution and reckless spending, followed by severe depressive states where she cannot function as an adult. Judge Vance opened the folder. Flipping through pages of pure fabrication, I knew exactly what it said. It said I was unstable. It said I was incapable of managing my own affairs. It said I needed a custodian. I looked down at my watch. It was 10:15 in the morning. My mind drifted back to 3 hours ago, to the cold reality of my bathroom mirror. I remembered staring at my reflection, a tube of expensive concealer in one hand and a bar of harsh soap in the other. I had a choice. I could have walked into this courtroom looking like Cassandra Hawthorne, the forensic auditor who had brought down 3 corrupt hedge funds in the last 2 years. I could have worn my tailored blazer, applied the red lipstick that made me feel like armor, and spoken with the sharp, clipped diction of a professional. But that would have been a mistake. If I looked competent, Victoria would change tactics. She would paint me as malicious instead of sick. She would say I was cruel, ungrateful, a daughter trying to hurt her mother, and judges, particularly traditional men like Vance, hated ungrateful daughters. But a sick daughter that elicited pity, that gave Victoria the moral high ground. So, at 7 in the morning, I had put the concealer away. I washed my face with the harsh soap to make my skin look red and blotchy. I chose the sweater I used for painting, the one with the faint stain of turpentine on the cuff. I skipped breakfast to ensure my hands would have a slight, tremor-like shake from low blood sugar. I was curating this image as carefully as I curated a crime scene. Miss Hawthorne. The judge's voice snapped me back to the present. He was looking at me, expecting an outburst, expecting the manic woman described in the file. I blinked slowly, looking up at him with wide, fearful eyes. I said nothing. I just picked at a loose thread on my sweater, pulling it until it snapped. She doesn't even respond to her own name half the time, Victoria sobbed, her voice rising in pitch. It breaks my heart, Your Honor. I just want to help her. I want to make sure she has a roof over her head and food to eat. We have evidence regarding the inheritance from her late grandmother, Sterling interjected, piling on the pressure. The late Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne left a trust fund of $500,000 to Cassandra 3 years ago. Based on our investigations, that account is currently overdrawn. A ripple of murmurs went through the few spectators in the back. I didn't need to turn around to know who they were. My Aunt Martha and Uncle Philip were sitting in the second row. I could practically feel their judgment radiating against my spine like heat from a radiator. I could picture Martha, her lips pursed in that permanent expression of distaste, shaking her head. Poor Victoria, she would be thinking, saddled with such a failure of a child. Martha, who had not worked a day in her life and lived off the dividends of a family trust she did not earn. And Philip, who was currently being investigated by the IRS for tax evasion, though he didn't know I was the one who had tipped them off anonymously 6 months ago. They were vultures waiting for a carcass, and Victoria was promising them a feast if they supported her play. She spent it all, Judge Vance asked, his eyebrows raising. $500,000 in 3 years. On nonsense, Victoria said, shaking her head tragically. She buys equipment, old computers, junk. She says she is building a machine to talk to the future. It is delusional. She rents a storage unit in Queens just to house this trash. She has squandered her grandmother's legacy on insanity while she starves herself. I tightened my jaw. The junk she referred to was a server farm worth $400,000. Comprised of high-density processing units cooling in a climate-controlled facility, it was the backbone of Obsidian Analytics. It was the reason I could crack a Swiss bank account's encryption in under 12 minutes. But to Victoria, Anything she did not understand was garbage, and anything she could not control was a threat. I tried to intervene, Victoria continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, leaning toward the judge. I tried to get her to sign over power of attorney voluntarily, just so I could stop the bleeding, just so I could save something for her future, but she threw a vase at me. She screamed that I was a demon sent to steal her soul. That was a lie. I had never thrown a vase. I had simply handed her a printed copy of the Fourth Amendment and asked her to leave my apartment. But the truth did not matter here. Only the narrative mattered. Sterling stepped forward again to deliver the killing blow. Your Honor, given the acute nature of Miss Hawthorne's condition and the rapid dissipation of her assets, we are asking for an emergency permanent conservatorship. We are asking that Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne be granted full legal control over Cassandra's person and estate, effective immediately. It is the only way to protect Cassandra from herself. The room went silent. This was it. The moment the trap was supposed to snap shut. A conservatorship. It was a legal death sentence. It meant I would not be able to sign a contract, marry, vote, or spend a single dollar without my mother's permission. I would become a child in the eyes of the law, owned by the woman who had spent my entire life chipping away at my self-esteem. Judge Vance leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking in the silence. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Victoria, a weeping, desperate mother in a designer suit. Then he looked at me, a silent, disheveled mess, staring at her own hands. The optics were perfect. The story was coherent. The medical evidence, however fraudulent, was on paper. Miss Hawthorne, Judge Vance said, addressing me directly, do you have anything to say regarding these serious allegations? Your lawyer has remained silent, but I want to hear from you. My court-appointed lawyer, a tired man named Mr. Henderson, who had barely glanced at my file, started to stand up, but I placed a hand on his arm to stop him. I looked up. I didn't look at the judge immediately. I looked at Victoria. She had lowered the handkerchief. Her eyes were dry now, and for a split second, the mask slipped. She looked at me not with pity, but with a cold, triumphant hunger. She thought she had won. She thought the silence was my surrender. She thought the $500,000 was gone, burnt on madness, and she was furious she hadn't been the one to spend it. I turned my gaze to Judge Vance. I kept my voice low, flat, devoid of emotion. I needed to maintain the persona for just a few minutes longer. I started, letting my voice trail off, then clearing my throat. I just want to go home. It was exactly what a beaten, mentally fragile person would say. Judge Vance sighed, a sound of heavy resignation. He looked at Victoria with sympathy. The court takes the welfare of vulnerable individuals very seriously, he began, and I could hear the gavel raising in his tone. Based on the testimony provided, the medical documents entered into evidence, and the defendant's own demeanor, he was convinced. He was about to sign my life away. I looked down at my wrist again. 10:22. Perfect. Victoria was smiling now, a tiny, imperceptible curl of the lip. Aunt Martha and Uncle Philip were shifting in their seats, ready to rush forward and offer their support to the grieving mother who had just secured the bag. They had no idea. They thought this silence was the silence of a victim. They did not understand that in my line of work, silence is not emptiness. Silence is data gathering. Silence is the calm before the breach. They saw a broken girl in a gray sweater. They did not see the predator drone hovering overhead, waiting for the target to walk into the open. And Victoria Hawthorne had just walked right into the crosshairs. While Judge Vance reviewed the fraudulent medical history that painted me as a danger to myself, my mind drifted away from the sterile, mahogany-lined courtroom. I let my eyes glaze over, maintaining the facade of the medicated daughter, but internally, I traveled 10 miles north to the 4th floor of a crumbling brick walk-up in the South Bronx. To the naked eye, apartment 4B was a testament to poverty. The hallway smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke. The front door had 3 locks, none of which looked secure enough to stop a determined shoulder. Inside, the plaster was peeling in long, scabby strips, and the linoleum floor in the kitchen was curled at the edges, revealing the grime of 3 decades. It was the perfect habitat for a failure. Exactly the kind of place Victoria expected her disappointments to live. But that was just the shell. If one were to pull back the moth-eaten rug in the bedroom, they would not find rotting wood. Instead, they would find a seamless panel of biometric locked reinforced steel. Beneath that false floor lay a climate-controlled, soundproofed server room that hummed with the quiet, expensive precision of a stealth bomber. This was my reality. I was not an unemployed artist wasting her life on meaningless sketches. I was a senior forensic security analyst for Obsidian Analytics, a private intelligence firm that did not advertise its existence. My clients were not art collectors. They were sovereign wealth funds, multinational banking conglomerates, and occasionally, federal agencies looking to trace assets that had vanished into the digital ether. I had built a fortress of solitude not because I was crazy, but because I was hiding. And I was not hiding from the government or the mob. I was hiding from the woman currently weeping into a handkerchief 20 feet away from me. Victoria Hawthorne was a financial predator. She did not love people. She acquired them. To her, a child was not a human being but an asset class, an extension of her own brand. If she had known that her mentally unstable daughter was billing $300 an hour to dismantle corporate fraud rings, she would not be trying to institutionalize me. She would be trying to monetize me. She would have latched onto my bank accounts with the tenacity of a leech, draining me dry while critiquing my spending habits. Growing up, the abuse was never physical. Victoria was too smart to leave bruises that a teacher might see. Her weapon of choice was comparison. She would sit me down in front of her vanity mirror, brushing my hair until my scalp burned, and sigh. She would tell me that it was a tragedy I had inherited my father's jawline, or that my eyes were too close together to ever be considered elegant. She stripped away my confidence layer by layer, like peeling paint, until I believed I was exactly what she said I was: useless, ugly, and lucky to have her. For years, I believed her. I stayed small. I stayed quiet. I let her dictate my life. That changed exactly 2 years ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November. I was running a routine penetration test for a client in Zurich when a notification pinged on my secondary monitor. It was an alert from the bank managing the trust fund my grandmother, Eleanor, had left me. The alert was an anomaly, a withdrawal request for $50,000. I froze. I had not touched that money. I had vowed to keep it as a safety net, the one thing Victoria could not touch because grandmother Eleanor, God rest her soul, had despised Victoria's spending habits and locked the trust down tight, or so we thought. I traced the transaction immediately. It had been authorized by a physical letter, signed by me. I pulled up the digital scan of the document from the bank's portal. The signature was perfect. It had the loop in the C and the sharp strike through the T that I used. But I looked closer, zooming in on the pixels until they fractured. The pressure points were wrong. A human hand varies pressure as it writes. A machine, or a person tracing a projection, maintains an unnatural consistency. It was a forgery, and there was only one person in the world who had access to my personal identifying information and the motivation to use it. At that moment, the daughter who craved her mother's approval died. The forensic auditor was born. My first instinct was to call the police. I had the evidence. I could have had her arrested for fraud that very afternoon. But as I sat in the glow of my monitors, listening to the hum of my servers, I realized that would be a mistake. If I sued her then, it would be a messy civil dispute. Victoria would hire expensive lawyers like Sterling. She would cry in court. She would claim it was a misunderstanding, or that I had given her verbal permission and simply forgotten. She would settle, pay a fine, and walk away with her reputation intact, painting me as the ungrateful daughter who sued her own mother over a clerical error. No, that was not justice. That was a slap on the wrist. I needed to destroy her, not physically, but systematically. I needed to dismantle her world with the same cold precision she had used to dismantle my self-esteem. So, I did nothing. I let the withdrawal go through. Then, I went to work. I accessed the bank's notification settings and rerouted all future alerts to a shadow email server I controlled. I wanted Victoria to think she had gotten away with it. I wanted her to think I was oblivious, too wrapped up in my mental illness to notice $500,000 bleeding out of my accounts. It takes a specific kind of discipline to watch someone rob you and smile at them the next day. For the last 24 months, I lived a double life that would have exhausted a lesser person. By day, I played the role Victoria had written for me. I stopped washing my hair regularly. I wore mismatched clothes. I stared at walls during family dinners, mumbling about radio waves and patterns in the wallpaper. I watched the satisfaction grow in Victoria's eyes as she saw her perfect daughter crumble. It fed her ego. It made her reckless. But by night, when the city slept and the Bronx grew quiet, I was the ghost auditor. I sat in my high-tech command center, bathed in the blue light of 6 monitors, and I went hunting. I did not just watch my own bank account. I went on the offensive. I hacked into the internal servers of V-Style Corporation, my mother's fashion empire. It was shockingly easy. Victoria spent thousands on office decor, but pennies on cybersecurity. Her password was the name of her first show pony, followed by the year she was born. What I found inside her servers was not just embezzlement. It was a masterclass in financial desperation. V-Style was a corpse propped up by debt and deceit. I found spreadsheets detailing consulting fees paid to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I found invoices for fabric sourcing that were actually payments to illegal gambling syndicates in Atlantic City. I spent hundreds of nights analyzing the flow of funds. I built a database of every dollar she stole from me and every dollar she hid from the Internal Revenue Service. I watched as she grew bolder. The withdrawals from my trust fund went from $50,000 to $100,000. She drained the account dry, convinced that I was too crazy to notice. Every time she stole, I logged it. Every time she forged my signature, I saved the metadata. Every time she lied to the IRS, I archived the proof. I became the architect of her downfall, laying the bricks of her prison cell one wire transfer at a time. The contrast between my two lives was jarring. I vividly remembered a lunch date 3 months ago. Victoria had taken me to a high-end bistro in Manhattan, mostly so she could be seen caring for her sick child. She had ordered a salad and lectured me on my posture while I picked at a bread roll. Feigning a tremor in my hand, she told me I looked like a homeless person and that she was embarrassed to be seen with me. "You are so ungrateful, Cassandra," she had sneered, sipping her Chardonnay. "I do everything for you. I manage your life because you are incapable of doing it yourself." I had looked at her, my eyes wide and vacant, and nodded obediently. "I know. Mother, I'm sorry. The numbers are just so loud today." She had rolled her eyes. Satisfied with my submission, she had no idea that 4 hours earlier, I had just finished compiling a 300-page dossier on her offshore tax evasion schemes. She had no idea that the homeless person sitting across from her had a net worth 3 times higher than her own, accumulated through legitimate contracts and shrewd cryptocurrency investments. She saw a broken bird. She did not see the viper coiled in the grass. Back in the courtroom, Judge Vance cleared his throat, pulling me out of the Bronx and back to the present. The air conditioning hummed, a dull drone that reminded me of my servers. "Given the circumstances," the judge said, looking at the papers Sterling had provided, "I am inclined to agree that immediate intervention is necessary." My heart rate remained steady, 62 beats per minute. Victoria was dabbing her eyes again, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was waiting for the gavel to fall. She was waiting for the moment she legally owned me. She was already mentally spending the equity in my apartment, unaware that I had already leveraged it to buy her debt. The mask of the mentally unstable daughter was heavy, and I was tired of wearing it. I had let them speak. I had let them lie. I had let them construct a reality that was built on pillars of sand. And now, it was time to kick the sand away. I looked at the water pitcher on the defendant's table. Condensation dripped down the side, pooling on the wood. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the oxygen fill my lungs. The gray rock was about to crack open, and they were not ready for what was inside. My mother thought she was the protagonist of this story. She thought this was a drama about a tragic mother saving her ruined child. She was wrong. This was a procedural thriller, and she was the suspect who had just walked into the interrogation room without a lawyer. It was time to introduce her to the ghost auditor. Just as Judge Vance was leaning forward to deliver what felt like a final verdict, the air in the courtroom shifted. It was a subtle change, like the drop in barometric pressure before a storm. My mother's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat. It was a wet, grating sound that demanded attention. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice slick with false apology, "before you make your ruling, we have two character witnesses who can testify to the severe degradation of Miss Hawthorne's mental state over the last 12 months. We believe their testimony is crucial to understanding the immediate danger she poses to herself." Judge Vance paused, his hand hovering over the gavel. He looked at the clock on the wall, then back at Sterling. "Make it brief, Counselor." "I call Mr. Mark Reynolds to the stand," Sterling announced. My stomach gave a single, hard lurch. Mark, I had not seen Mark in 6 months. Seeing him walk through the double doors of the courtroom was like watching a mistake from my past manifest in flesh and blood. He was wearing a suit that I knew for a fact he could not afford, likely purchased by Victoria specifically for this performance. His hair was gelled back, and he wore an expression of pained reluctance that was about as authentic as a $3 bill. Mark was a bartender I had dated for a brief, regrettable period when I was feeling particularly lonely and disconnected from humanity. He was charming in a surface-level way, the kind of man who borrowed money for investment opportunities that never materialized. I had broken up with him when I caught him trying to guess the passcode to my phone while I was in the shower. He took the stand, swore on the Bible, and sat down, avoiding my eyes. "Mr. Reynolds," Sterling began, pacing in front of the witness box. "You were in a romantic relationship with the defendant, Cassandra Hawthorne. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Mark said, his voice dropping to a somber register. "We were together for 8 months. "And why did that relationship end?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't handle the episodes anymore. It was scary. She started seeing things that weren't there." "Could you be more specific?" Sterling pressed. "She would sit in the corner of her living room," Mark said, finally looking at me with a look of practiced pity. "She would stare at a blank wall and just start arguing with people, screaming at them, but there was no one there. She'd be shouting about payloads and encryption keys and black sites. It was gibberish. She was completely detached from reality." I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of indifference, but internally, I was rolling my eyes. Mark was not entirely lying. He was just too unintelligent to understand what he had seen. I did not talk to walls. I used a military-grade bone conduction earpiece that sat flush against the mastoid bone behind my ear, completely invisible under my hair. The arguments he witnessed were high-stakes conference calls with defense contractors or government liaisons. The gibberish was technical jargon used to coordinate penetration tests on secure servers. I remembered the specific night he was referring to. I was not screaming. I was firmly telling a section chief at the National Security Agency that his firewall configuration was as porous as a sieve. But to Mark, the bartender who thought encryption was a type of puzzle game, I was simply a madwoman yelling at plaster. "Did she ever involve you in these delusions?" Sterling asked. "Yes," Mark nodded earnestly. "She used to ask me for money, not a lot. Just she would say she needed cash to buy tokens or coins. She said she was investing in the future of money. But when I asked to see her bank account, she showed me a screen with cartoons on it, pictures of dogs and pixelated punks. She threw thousands of dollars into these fake games while we were struggling to pay for dinner." The courtroom murmured, to the uninitiated jury of public opinion. I sounded like a child wasting money on video games. In reality, Mark was referring to my early investments in cryptocurrency and non-fungible tokens, specifically during the market dip 2 years ago. The cartoons he mocked were digital assets I had flipped for a 400% profit. Funding the very server farm that now hummed beneath my floorboards, I had never asked him for money. He had projected his own financial insecurity onto me. "She is sick," Mark finished, his voice trembling slightly. "I tried to help her, but she just kept talking to the voices in her head." Victoria, sitting in the front row, covered her mouth with her hand, shaking her head as if the memory of my illness was too much to bear. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," Sterling said. He turned to the judge. "We also call Mr. Gary Henderson, the building superintendent of Miss Hawthorne's apartment complex in the Bronx." Mark stepped down, and Mr. Henderson took his place. He was a squat, irritable man who smelled of tobacco and had hated me from the moment I moved in because I refused to let him enter my apartment for routine inspections without 24 hours of written notice. "Mr. Henderson," Sterling asked, "describe Miss Hawthorne as a tenant." "Reclusive," Henderson grunted. "Weird, never goes out, the blinds are always drawn, but the packages, that's the strange part. The packages, every week," Henderson said, gesturing with his thick hands. "Huge boxes, heavy stuff, marked fragile or with foreign writing on them, electronic parts, cooling fans. She drags them inside and I never see them again. And the electricity usage her meter spins like a top. I told her she's going to blow a fuse one day, but she just stares at me with those dead eyes." "Does she have visitors?" "Never," Henderson said. "Just her in those boxes. It's not right. A young woman living like a hermit crab. Smells like ozone in the hallway near her door sometimes. She's cooking something in there, or she's hoarding junk. Either way, it's a fire hazard." Sterling nodded gravely. "Isolation. Hoarding. Erratic behavior. Thank you. Mr. Henderson." Sterling turned to the judge, his chest puffed out. "Your Honor, you have heard the testimony. This is not just a quirky artist. This is a woman living in squalor, hallucinating, and hoarding dangerous equipment while wasting her inheritance. She needs help." Judge Vance looked at me. The sympathy in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary concern. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "does the defense wish to cross-examine these witnesses?" My court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Henderson, no relation to the super, but equally useless, started to stand up. He looked ready to ask a few perfunctory questions just to say he did his job. I placed my hand firmly on his wrist. "No," I whispered. He looked at me, confused. "Cassandra, we should at least challenge the boyfriend's—" "No questions," I said, louder this time, my voice carrying to the bench. I looked straight at Victoria. She was watching me, her eyes narrowing slightly. She expected me to fight. She expected me to scream that Mark was a liar, that Henderson was a snoop. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could point a finger and say, "See, unstable." I would not give her the satisfaction. "The defense has no questions for these witnesses, Your Honor," I said clearly. "Let them finish." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Sterling blinked, caught off guard. He had prepared for a fight. My surrender made him nervous, but he quickly recovered, mistaking my strategy for defeat. "Very well," Sterling said, a smirk creeping onto his face. "If the defendant has nothing to say, we have one final piece of evidence, a video recording taken 2 weeks ago by a private investigator hired by Mrs. Hawthorne to ensure her daughter's safety." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and handed it to the bailiff. "I must warn the court. The behavior in this video is disturbing." The bailiff plugged the drive into the court's media system. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, likely from a car parked across the street from my apartment building. The timestamp in the corner read January 7th, 2 o'clock in the morning. On the screen, a figure stumbled out of the apartment building's back exit. It was me, I looked deranged. My hair was wild, sticking up in every direction. I was wearing oversized pajamas and a coat that was too big for me. I was carrying a metal trash can in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. The camera zoomed in. In the video, I was muttering frantically, looking over my shoulder every 2 seconds as if demons were chasing me. I threw the papers into the metal bin. Then, I struck a match. The flames roared up, illuminating my face. I looked manic. I was laughing a silent, hysterical laugh as I shoved more papers into the fire. I poked at the burning pile with a stick, watching the ashes fly up into the night air. "I have to burn them," the video Cassandra muttered. The audio picked up by a directional microphone. "They can't see. They can't know. Burn it all. Burn the numbers." The video ended with me kicking the trash can over and running back inside the building like a frightened animal. The courtroom erupted. "Order!" Judge Vance shouted, banging his gavel. "Order in this court." But the damage was done. The jury of public opinion had returned a verdict. I heard Aunt Martha gasp loudly from the back row. "Oh, dear God," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's completely gone." Victoria let out a sob that sounded like a wounded animal. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "My poor baby," she wailed. "I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know." Judge Vance looked at the blank screen, then at me. His expression was one of pity, mixed with horror. There was no explaining that away. That was not eccentricity. That was psychosis. "Miss Hawthorne," the judge said, his voice grave. "Do you have an explanation for what we just saw?" I sat there, looking at the black screen. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room burning into me. They saw a crazy woman burning trash in an alley at 2 a.m. I saw a successful operation. I lowered my head, hiding a smile that threatened to break through my facade. They thought that video was the smoking gun that proved my insanity. In reality, it was the bait for the trap I had set for Victoria. I remembered that night perfectly. I had known the private investigator was there. My perimeter security system had alerted me to his presence 3 days prior. I knew his license plate number, his home address, and the fact that he was overcharging my mother by 30%. I had staged that entire scene for his benefit. And the papers I was burning, they weren't just random trash. They were carefully forged bank statements, statements that I had created to look like official documents from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I had printed them out, crumpled them up, and then smoothed them out again to look used. I made sure to burn them slowly enough that the long lens camera could catch glimpses of the logos. I wanted Victoria to see that video. I wanted her to see me burning financial documents. Why? Because I needed her to believe that I was destroying evidence of my own imaginary crimes. I needed her to believe that I was paranoid about money, so that she would not look too closely at where the real money was going. I needed her to think I was covering my tracks, so she would feel safe enough to stop covering hers. It was the honeypot. Make the enemy think you are weak, disorganized, and scared. So they become arrogant, sloppy, and bold. Victoria's reaction confirmed it worked. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was relieved. She thought I was destroying the only records that could possibly implicate me in anything, leaving me defenseless. Sterling stood tall, adjusting his cufflinks. "Your Honor," he said, his voice booming with confidence. "The defense rests. The evidence is clear. Cassandra Hawthorne is a danger to herself and society. She is burning documents in alleyways. She is hallucinating. We ask that you grant the conservatorship immediately to prevent any further tragedy." Judge Vance nodded slowly. He reached for his pen to sign the order that would strip me of my rights. "Miss Hawthorne," Vance said, "unless you have something substantial to add, I am ready to rule." I watched his hand move toward the paper. The pen hovered inches above the line. The trap was primed. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it hummed. Victoria was peeking through her fingers, watching the pen, her eyes gleaming with greed. It was time. I stood up. The movement was not the jerky, nervous motion of the girl in the video. It was smooth, controlled, and deliberate. I pushed the chair back, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the murmurs. "I do, Your Honor," I said. My voice was different. The tremble was gone. The whisper was gone. The vocal fry of the scared little girl had evaporated. In its place was the cool, resonant tone I used when briefing the board of directors of a Fortune 500 company. "I have something to add," I repeated, looking directly at the judge, then slowly turning my head to lock eyes with Victoria. "But I will need more than a few words. I will need the projector." Victoria's hands froze on her face. The sobbing stopped instantly. She stared at me, and for the first time since the trial began. I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't know this Cassandra. "The projector?" Judge Vance asked, blinking in confusion. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, reaching down to pick up my battered leather bag. "You asked where the money went. You asked why I was burning papers. And my mother asked for the truth." I unzipped the bag. Inside was not a sketchbook or a knitting project. It was a military-grade laptop with a carbon fiber casing. "I think it is time everyone got exactly what they asked for. Mr. Sterling held up a stack of documents as if they were the 10 Commandments, his chest puffing out with the self-righteous air of a man who believed he had just won the lottery. He walked toward the jury box, though there was no jury here, only the judge and the court of public opinion sitting in the gallery, and let the papers thud onto the table in front of Judge Vance. $2 million, Sterling announced, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "Your Honor, these are the transaction records from the trust fund established by the late Eleanor Hawthorne. When this fiscal year began, the account held a balance of exactly $2 million in liquid assets and blue-chip stocks. As of this morning, the balance is zero." A collective gasp swept through the room. It was theatrical, perfectly timed, and entirely predictable. My Aunt Martha pressed a hand to her chest, looking as though she might faint from the sheer scandal of it all. Uncle Philip shook his head, muttering about fiscal irresponsibility, conveniently forgetting the tax evasion scheme I knew he was running through a landscaping business in New Jersey. "Zero," Judge Vance repeated, picking up the top sheet. His eyes scanned the columns of red ink. "This money was moved out in a series of wire transfers over the last 12 months. Where did it go?" Sterling turned to point an accusatory finger at me. "That is the question, Your Honor. We believe Miss Hawthorne, in her delusional state, has either squandered this fortune on invisible investments, fallen victim to internet scams, or simply given it away to voices in her head. The beneficiary descriptions on these transfers are nonsense. Project Aegis, Cerberus Protocol, Hades Fund. These sound like the inventions of a mind that has lost its tether to reality." He leaned on the railing, looking down at me with a sneer disguised as pity. "She is destitute, Your Honor. She has burned through a generational fortune in 1 year. If that does not prove she is mentally incompetent and in urgent need of a conservator, I do not know what does." Victoria stood up then. She did not lunge for the spotlight. She glided into it. She gripped the back of the bench in front of her, her knuckles white, her face a portrait of maternal devastation. "I tried to stop her," she choked out, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "I saw the statements. I begged her to let me help manage the portfolio, but she just laughed. She told me the money was needed for the Great Reset. Your Honor, please, she doesn't understand the value of $1. She is a child playing with fire, and she has burned down the house. I need this conservatorship not to control her, but to save her from starving on the street. I have to save what little is left of my daughter." Judge Vance looked at her. Then he looked at me. His expression had hardened. The pity was gone, replaced by the stern disapproval of a man who respected money and despised waste. "Miss Hawthorne," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, "you have refused to answer questions until now, but I'm ordering you to answer this one. $2 million is a life-changing sum for most people. Where did that money go?" I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. This was the fulcrum. This was the moment the entire weight of the trial rested upon. They expected me to stammer. They expected me to claim I invested it in magic beans, or that the government stole it. I stood up, smoothing the front of my oversized sweater. I looked at the laptop I had placed on the table, then up at the judge. I did not spend a single cent of that money, Your Honor, I said. My voice was calm, contrasting sharply with the hysteria in the room. The records show otherwise, Vance snapped, tapping the paper. It says, transfer out. The balance is 0. The records show exactly what I wanted them to show, I replied. You are looking at the bait. Judge Vance, you are not looking at the trap. I saw Sterling frown. Victoria's tears stopped instantly, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? The judge asked. I am talking about a honeypot, I said. The term hung in the air, unfamiliar to the legal minds in the room but terrifiedly clear to anyone who worked in cybersecurity. A honeypot, I continued, is a decoy computer system set up to trap hackers. It looks like a vulnerable target. It looks like it contains valuable data, but in reality, it is an isolated environment designed to monitor, log, and identify the intruder. It is a digital cage. I walked around the table, moving toward the center of the room. My mother claims I am incompetent because I let $2 million vanish. She claims she tried to intervene, but the truth is, she did not try to stop the transfers. She initiated them. Objection. Sterling shouted. This is slander. Mrs. Hawthorne is the one alerting the court to the theft. Overruled, Vance said, his curiosity piqued. Let her speak. You said she initiated them. Miss Hawthorne, explain. I took a breath, letting my mind travel back to the night I built the cage. It was 18 months ago. I had been sitting in my server room, the hum of the cooling fans providing a white noise backdrop to my coding. I knew Victoria had been trying to access my trust fund. I had seen the failed login attempts on the bank's portal clumsy, brute force attempts using my birth date, my social security number, the names of my childhood pets. She was phishing. Most people would have changed their password to something uncrackable and enabled two-factor authentication. I did the opposite. I realized that if I simply locked her out, she would find another way. She would forge physical documents, as she had done before. She would drag me to court. She would escalate. I needed to catch her in the act, and I needed the evidence to be undeniable. So, I created a shadow account. I wrote a script that mirrored the interface of the legitimate bank portal. It looked identical to the real thing, same logo, same font, same layout. Then, I changed my password to the one thing I knew her narcissism would lead her to try eventually. Victoria is right. It took her 3 days to guess it. I remembered watching the alert pop up on my screen at 2 a.m. Login successful. User agent Safari on iPad. Location the penthouse, Upper East Side. I created a vulnerability on purpose, I told the courtroom, my voice steady. I knew my mother was trying to access my accounts, so I gave her the key. I allowed her to log in. I allowed her to see a balance of $2 million, and then I allowed her to steal it. Victoria's face had gone pale, her mouth slightly open. When my mother initiated those transfers, I explained, she thought she was moving money from my account into a series of offshore holding companies she had set up in the Cayman Islands. She thought she was being clever. She thought she was draining me dry before I could waste it. I turned to look directly at Victoria. But you weren't logging into the bank. Mother, you were logging into my server. And those offshore companies you thought you were sending the money to, I didn't just find them. I bought the domain names. I intercepted the routing numbers. I control them. The money did not vanish, I said to the judge. Every time she clicked transfer, the funds were indeed moved. But they were not spent. They were moved into a blind escrow account that I established specifically to hold this evidence, a secure, interest-bearing holding tank that neither I nor she could touch without a court order. I walked back to my laptop and plugged the HDMI cable into the port. But I didn't just save the money, I recorded the thief. The projector screen behind the judge flickered to life. You see, the honeypot doesn't just catch the data, I said, typing a command into the terminal. It catches the user. On the screen, a log file appeared. It was a list of dates, times, and IP addresses. Every time Victoria Hawthorne logged into my account to steal $10,000, $20,000, or $50,000, my system logged her device's MAC address. It logged her GPS coordinates, confirming the device was located within the walls of her penthouse. I hit another key. But IP addresses can be spoofed. Locations can be faked. I needed more. I needed a face. The screen changed. A grid of photographs appeared. The courtroom fell deathly silent. They were photos taken from the front-facing camera of an iPad. The angle was low, looking up at the user's chin and nose, but the face was unmistakable. It was Victoria. In one photo, she was wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of red wine in one hand while her other hand hovered over the screen. In another, she was wearing a mud mask, looking intently at the device. In a third, she was smiling a cold, satisfied smirk as she tapped the button that she thought was robbing her daughter blind. This is the feature of the honeypot regarding active countermeasures, I narrated, pointing to the screen. When the user confirms a fraudulent transfer, the script triggers the device's camera to capture a frame. These are not just photos. They are time-stamped proofs of authorized access. Here is Victoria Hawthorne on October 3rd, transferring $50,000. Here she is on Christmas Eve, transferring $100,000 while I was sitting across the room from her opening presents. I looked at Sterling. He was staring at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. There was no legal precedent for this in his playbook. He had prepared for a competency hearing, not a digital ambush. The $2 million is safe. Your Honor, I said, closing the laptop lid with a soft click. It sits in the escrow account, untouched. The only thing that has been stolen is the illusion that my mother is a concerned parent. She committed wire fraud, I continued, my voice hardening. She committed identity theft, and she did it repeatedly, methodically, over the course of a year. She didn't want a conservatorship because I am crazy. She wanted it because she thought she had already stolen everything, and she needed legal cover to hide the crime. Victoria was shaking her head violently now. No, she whispered, her voice rising to a shriek. That's fake. It's a deep fake. She's a computer genius. She made it up. The metadata is embedded in the blockchain, I replied calmly. It is immutable. It cannot be forged, altered, or deleted. And I have already sent a copy of the private keys to the district attorney's office. The judge looked from the screen to Victoria. The sternness in his face had evolved into something much darker. He was a man of the law, and he realized he had almost been used as a weapon to facilitate a grand larceny. Mr. Sterling, Judge Vance said, his voice dangerously quiet. I suggest you advise your client to sit down and remain silent, because if she says one more word that contradicts this evidence, I will have her held in contempt before the bailiff can even get the handcuffs out. I stood there, alone in the center of the room. The crazy girl in the oversized sweater was gone. The ghost auditor had arrived. I watched Victoria sink into her chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, that I couldn't survive in the real world without her guidance. She had underestimated the one thing she never bothered to nurture my mind. She thought she was playing chess with a pigeon. She didn't realize she was playing purely on a board I had designed, with pieces I had carved, according to rules I had written. The defense is not finished, Your Honor, I said, breaking the silence. This was just the theft. Now, I would like to talk about the taxes. The color drained from Uncle Philip's face in the back row. I was just getting started. The silence that followed my revelation of the photos should have been the end of the war. In any logical world, catching a thief with their hand in the digital cookie jar, backed by time-stamped photographic evidence, would result in an immediate summary judgment. But I had made a critical error in my calculations. I had assumed that Victoria Hawthorne operated within the bounds of shame. I had assumed that when stripped naked by the truth, she would cover herself and retreat. I was wrong. Victoria did not feel shame. She felt only the desperate, clawing need for survival, and a cornered animal does not surrender. It bites. Just as the whispers in the gallery began to turn against her. My mother straightened her spine. She wiped the shock from her face with a terrifying speed, replacing it with a look of profound, sorrowful resolve. She nodded to Sterling, a sharp, imperceptible jerk of her chin. Sterling, who had been gaping at the projector screen like a fish on dry land, seemed to snap back to reality. He reached into his briefcase, bypassing the files he had already used, and pulled out a single, sealed envelope. It was thick, heavy, and ominous. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice regaining its oily confidence. "While the defendant's little slideshow is certainly theatrical, it completely lacks context." Judge Vance looked down from the bench, his patience visibly fraying. "Context, Mr. Sterling. We have photos of your client accessing an account she claimed she had no access to. She had access because she was given access," Sterling declared, ripping the envelope open. "And not just via a password. We have written authorization." He marched to the bench and slammed a document down on the mahogany surface. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "This," Sterling announced, turning to face the gallery, "is a general power of attorney and a loan authorization agreement. Signed and dated 6 months ago. In it, Cassandra Hawthorne explicitly grants Victoria Hawthorne the right to manage her assets, including the trust fund, and specifically authorizes the use of those funds to secure a bridge loan for V-Style Corporation." My heart stopped. It didn't stutter. It simply ceased to beat for a terrifying second. I had never signed such a document. I knew every piece of paper I had touched in the last decade. I read terms and conditions for software updates that other people blindly scrolled past. There was no universe in which I would hand over my autonomy to Victoria. "Furthermore," Sterling continued, his voice rising in triumph, "this document authorizes the mortgaging of the property located at 42 East 64th Street, the apartment inherited from Eleanor Hawthorne." The room spun. That apartment was not just an asset, it was my sanctuary. It was the only place I had ever felt safe. It was where Grandmother Eleanor had taught me to play chess, where she had whispered that I was smart, not strange. It was the holy ground of my childhood. "She mortgaged the apartment?" Judge Vance asked, picking up the document. He looked at it closely, his brows knitting together. "To save the family business," Sterling said, "with Cassandra's full consent. But now she stands here, claiming theft, Your Honor. This proves exactly what Dr. Arrington's report stated. Cassandra has moments of lucidity where she agrees to help her mother, followed by paranoid amnesia where she views those same actions as persecution. She signed this, she agreed to this, and now she has forgotten it entirely." He pointed a finger at me, a weaponized gesture. "She is not a victim of theft, Your Honor. She is a victim of her own broken mind. She authorized the transfer of that $2 million to save her mother's company. And her illness has twisted that memory into a crime." The trap was elegant, it was brutal, and it was terrifyingly effective. If I denied the signature, I looked like a liar, because Victoria would not present a document that couldn't pass a cursory visual inspection. If I admitted to it, I destroyed my own case and proved I was incompetent. It recontextualized everything. The honeypot was no longer a trap for a thief. It was the paranoid delusion of a woman entrapping her own authorized agent. "Miss Hawthorne," Judge Vance said. His voice was cold now. The warmth of the previous moment had evaporated. He held the document up. "Is this your signature?" I walked forward. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through wet concrete. I approached the bench and looked at the paper. It was a standard legal form, dense with jargon, but at the bottom, right above the black line, was my name, Cassandra Elizabeth Hawthorne. I stared at it. It was my signature. It had the sharp loop on the C. It had the aggressive cross on the T. It had the slight downward slant at the end that I had adopted in college. To a layperson, to a bank teller, even to a judge. It was identical to the signature on my driver's license. But I was not a layperson. I was a forensic auditor. I spent my life looking at the microscopic details that other people missed. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing. A human hand is an imperfect instrument. When we write, the pressure varies. We hesitate slightly on the upstroke. We press harder on the downstroke. The ink bleeds unevenly into the fibers of the paper depending on the speed of the pen. It is called line quality. This signature had no soul. The ink distribution was mathematically perfect. The pressure was uniform from the first letter to the last. There was no pen lift, the microscopic gap where the pen leaves the paper to move to the next stroke. It was too fluid. It was too consistent. It was a machine forgery, high-end, likely an auto pen device, the kind used by politicians to sign thousands of thank you letters, or by fraudsters to steal empires. "Miss Hawthorne," the judge repeated, his tone impatient. "I asked you a question. Is this your signature?" I looked up. My eyes met Victoria's. She was not crying anymore. She was looking at me with a gaze that chilled my blood. It was a look of absolute, predatory dominance. Her eyes bored into mine, communicating a message clearer than any spoken word. Admit it. Be the good, sick daughter. Go to the facility. Let me have the money, or I will destroy everything you have left. She knew it was a fake. She knew I knew it was a fake, and she was daring me to prove it. I started, but my voice caught. Sterling jumped in, sensing blood. "She is confused. Your Honor, look at her. She doesn't remember signing it because she was in a manic state. This establishes the pattern. She builds traps for her mother because she has forgotten that she is the one who invited her in. This is a tragedy. But it is a medical tragedy, not a criminal one." The atmosphere in the courtroom suffocated me. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of their judgment. I could feel Aunt Martha's eyes on my back, burning with vindication. "I told you so." She was probably whispering, crazy just like her father. "We need an emergency ruling," Sterling demanded, pounding the table. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on the grandmother's apartment because the loan payments which Cassandra authorized have not been made due to her freezing the accounts. If you do not grant Mrs. Hawthorne conservatorship right now, the property will be lost. The assets will be seized. We cannot wait another day." Judge Vance looked at the document, then at me. He looked disappointed. That was the worst part. He had wanted to believe me. He had wanted to see justice, but the paper in his hand was an anchor dragging him back to the safe. Logical conclusion: the daughter is unwell. "Miss Hawthorne," Vance said, and he sounded tired. "The evidence here is compelling. A notarized document, a signature that appears valid. If you cannot provide a concrete explanation for this, I have no choice but to consider the mental health petition valid. The safety of the estate is my priority." He was going to do it. He was going to sign the order. I looked at the clock. 10:45. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind suddenly went cold. Ice cold. This was the Grey Rock's breaking point. The passive defense had failed. The honeypot had caught the thief, but the thief had brought a bazooka to a knife fight. I looked at the signature one last time. It was a beautiful forgery. It was a work of art, and it was the mistake that was going to bury her. I slowly straightened my back. I felt the slouch of the depressed artist fall away. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest. I lifted my chin, exposing my neck, no longer protecting myself. I let my hands drop to my sides, not fidgeting, not picking at my sweater, but hanging loose and ready. The transformation was physical, and it was immediate. I saw Judge Vance blink. He saw the girl in the oversized sweater vanish, replaced by someone else entirely. "No, Your Honor," I said. My voice did not tremble. It resonated off the wood paneling, clear and sharp as a bell. "That is not my signature," I stated, "and I am not confused." "The document is notarized," Sterling shouted, though he took a half step back. Unnerved by the sudden shift in my demeanor, I turned to face the room. I looked at Sterling, then I looked at Victoria. I held her gaze. And for the first time in my life, I did not look for approval. I looked for a target. "You want to talk about the estate?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with a dangerous edge. "You want to talk about protecting assets? Fine, let us talk." I turned back to Judge Vance. I placed my hands on the defense table and leaned forward, looking him squarely in the eye. I was no longer the defendant. I was the expert witness in my own life. "Your Honor," I said, "you have heard the lies. You have seen the theatrics. You have seen a video of me burning paper, and you have seen a document that claims to be my surrender." I paused, letting the silence stretch, holding the room in the palm of my hand. "I am asking for the right to defend myself," I continued. "Not as a daughter, not as a patient, but as a forensic specialist. I am asking you to pause your judgment. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes to examine that document. 10 minutes to present the rebuttal." "You have a lawyer," Vance noted, gesturing to the useless Mr. Henderson. "Mr. Henderson is a fine public defender," I said. "But he does not know the difference between a pen stroke and a pixel. I do." I pointed at the screen where my laptop was still connected. "You wanted to know who I really am." "Mother," I said, not looking at her but addressing the room. "You called me unstable. You called me a failure. You forced me into this corner thinking I would curl up and die." I grabbed the HDMI cable and held it up like a detonator. "Thieves and liars hate the light," I said, "and I am about to turn on the sun. I request permission to approach the evidence and conduct a live analysis," I said to the judge. "Grant me 10 minutes, Your Honor. If I cannot prove that document is a fake in 10 minutes, you can lock me away forever. I will sign the papers myself." Victoria gasped. Sterling looked at the judge, panic flaring in his eyes. "Objection. This is highly irregular. She is not an expert witness." "I am the expert," I snapped, my voice cutting through his protest. "And I am the only one in this room who knows exactly what happens when you put a laser-printed lie under a microscope." Judge Vance looked at me. He saw the steel in my spine. He saw the intelligence that I had hidden for 3 decades burning in my eyes. He looked at the clock. 10 minutes, Vance said. "You have 10 minutes. Miss Hawthorne, make them count." The gavel did not fall, and that was the first victory. Judge Vance sat back in his chair, his face unreadable, and nodded once. 10 minutes, he repeated. "The clock starts now." I did not waste a second. I reached into my battered leather satchel, the one my mother had called an eyesore earlier that morning, and pulled out a tablet. It was not a consumer-grade device used for watching movies or playing games. It was a ruggedized field unit with a matte black casing, the kind used by forensic accountants during site raids. I plugged the connection cable into the court's audiovisual system with a definitive click. The transformation was immediate. I felt the physical weight of the victim, the poor Cassandra, slide off my shoulders like a wet coat. I stood taller, my spine straightened, adding 2 full inches to my height. I pushed my glasses up my nose, not with a nervous jitter, but with a precise, deliberate motion. I looked out at the gallery, at the rows of faces that had looked at me with pity and disdain just moments ago. They were not looking at a mental patient anymore. They were looking at a prosecutor. "My mother told this court that I am mentally unstable because I cannot track my own finances," I began. My voice filled the room, projecting to the back wall without a microphone. It was steady, cool, and commanding. "She claims I burned through my inheritance on delusions. She claims I do not know where the money went." I tapped the screen of my tablet. The projector behind the judge flashed white, then resolved into a complex, high-definition visualization. It was a network graph, a web of nodes and lines glowing in sharp blue and angry red against a black background. "The truth is," I said, turning to face Victoria, "I know exactly where every single penny went. I tracked it, I categorized it, and I watched it land." "What is this?" Judge Vance asked. leaning forward, his eyes scanning the complex diagram. This, Your Honor, is a flow of funds analysis, I explained, walking toward the screen. I used a laser pointer, the red dot dancing across the projected image. It traces the life cycle of the $2 million that was removed from my trust fund. I circled the large blue node on the left. This is the Hawthorne Family Trust, the source. I traced the red lines shooting out from the source like arteries. And these are the transfers my mother initiated. She labeled them variously as capital investment, emergency liquidity, and personal loan. But look where they go. The red lines converged on a cluster of smaller nodes in the center of the screen. These are shell companies, I stated. Blue Heron Holdings, Apex Consulting Group, the Sovereign Strategy Fund. They sound impressive, don't they? They sound like legitimate investment vehicles. I tapped the tablet again. The nodes expanded, revealing their registration details. But they are not. They are pass-through entities. They have no employees, no offices, no products. They exist solely as bank accounts registered to P.O. boxes in Delaware and Nevada. I looked at Sterling. He was sweating. He knew enough about corporate law to know that piercing the corporate veil was dangerous territory. And where does the money go after it hits these shell companies? I asked rhetorically. I swiped my finger across the tablet. The red lines on the screen shot out from the shell companies and converged on a single, massive node on the right side of the chart. It was labeled in bold, white letters, V-Style Corporation. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. V-Style, I said, my voice dripping with disdain. My mother's fashion empire, the company that is supposedly booming, the company she claims she was trying to protect from my insanity. Objection, Sterling shot out of his chair, his face flushing red. This is preposterous. These are fabricated graphics. The defendant has drawn a pretty picture to confuse the court. There is no proof that these lines represent real money. Victoria was gripping the armrests of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. She leaned towards Sterling, whispering furiously into his ear. She looked pale, the blood draining from her perfectly made-up face. Fabricated. I repeated the word, tasting it. I turned to Judge Vance. Mister, Sterling is right to be skeptical. In the age of Photoshop, anyone can make a chart. I walked back to the table and typed a rapid command into the terminal. But this is not a drawing, Your Honor. And this is not a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that I typed up in my bedroom. The screen shifted. The pretty graphics vanished, replaced by scrolling lines of code and raw database entries. It looked like the Matrix to the uninitiated, but to the judge, the headers were clear. Source Swift transaction logs / verified blockchain ledger. This is a direct data extraction from the banking servers, I said, my voice hard as steel. Every transaction you see here is cryptographically signed. That means it has a digital fingerprint that cannot be altered without breaking the encryption of the entire banking system. Unless Mr. Sterling is suggesting that I managed to hack the Federal Reserve from a laptop in the Bronx. This data is immutable fact. I pointed to a specific line item. Let us look at entry number 421, I said. Date November 12th, amount $150,000. Source my trust fund, intermediary Apex Consulting Group, final destination V-Style Corp, accounts payable. I zoomed in on the entry. The memo line for the deposit into V-Style's account reads, Consulting fees for C. Hawthorne. I paused, letting the absurdity sink in. I looked at my mother. Consulting fees. Mother, you paid yourself $150,000 of my money for consulting. I haven't stepped foot in your office in 5 years. What exactly did I consult on? The color of the drapes. Victoria flinched as if I had slapped her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at the judge, her eyes wide with panic. It gets better, I continued, relentless. Let's cross-reference these consulting payments with your calendar. I brought up a split screen. On the left were the bank transfers. On the right was Victoria's public social media feed and her company's official itinerary, which I had scraped from the web. On August 14th, I narrated, pointing to the screen. A transfer of $75,000 was made from my trust to a shell company, and then immediately wired to a luxury resort in the Maldives. I pointed to the right side of the screen. And here's an Instagram post from August 15th. Soaking up the sun on a solo retreat, blessed girl boss. The courtroom was silent enough to hear a pin drop. You claimed in your affidavit that you were on a business trip to source silk in Italy, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. But the money trail says you were paying off a personal vacation with stolen funds. You laundered my inheritance through a fake consulting firm to pay for your tan. That is a lie, Victoria shrieked. Standing up, her composure shattered completely. I worked for that money. I managed the family. I deserve it. Sit down, Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Vance barked, slamming his gavel. You will maintain order. Victoria sank back down, realizing too late that she had just admitted to taking the money. I mean, she owed me, she stammered. For raising her, it was reimbursement. Reimbursement is not labeled as consulting fees in a corporate ledger, I countered instantly. That is tax fraud. Mother, you categorized it as a business expense to write it off against your company's taxes. You stole my money, and then you used the theft to lower your tax bill to the IRS? I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this pattern repeats 37 times over the last 12 months. Every single time my mother claimed I was wasting money, she was actually siphoning it into V-style to cover operating losses and personal extravagances. The projects she claimed I was investing in, they don't exist. The only project here was keeping her bankrupt company afloat using my grandmother's legacy. I switched the view back to the flow of funds chart. The sheer scale of the theft was overwhelming when viewed all at once. It was a massive red drain, sucking the life out of my trust fund and pumping it into a failing fashion house. Mr. Sterling called me unstable, I said, lowering my voice to a dangerous whisper. He said I needed a conservator. But looking at these numbers, looking at a CEO who has to steal from her own daughter to make payroll, I have to ask, who is the one who is truly out of control here? I looked at Victoria. The arrogance was gone. The Concerned Mother Act had dissolved. In its place was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. She was looking at the screen, at the lines of red code that documented her crimes, and she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had thought I was painting pictures in the dark. She didn't know I was building a digital panopticon. I am not done, I said, checking the time. I still have 4 minutes left on my 10-minute clock, and I haven't even touched on the loan document yet. I saw Sterling physically recoil. He looked at the thick envelope on the judge's desk, the forged power of attorney, and for the first time, he looked like he wanted to set it on fire. He realized, perhaps a second too late, that he had just submitted a forged document to a Supreme Court judge. The loan authorization, I said, turning my attention to the piece of paper that was supposed to be my death warrant. The one Mr. Sterling claims I signed. I tapped the tablet, bringing up a new window. But, Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom like a scalpel. Theft is merely the entry-level offense here. If this were simply a case of a mother stealing $2 million from her daughter, we would be in state court arguing over restitution. But Victoria Hawthorne is not just a thief. She is a tax cheat of the highest order. The room went deadly silent. Accusing someone of stealing from family was one thing. Accusing them of defrauding the United States government was entirely another. I tapped the screen of the tablet again. The complex web of red and blue lines that documented the flow of funds vanished, replaced by a split-screen view. On the left was a digitized copy of Victoria's federal tax return from the previous fiscal year. On the right was a corporate registration document from the Cayman Islands. This, I said, pointing to the document on the right, is the incorporation paper for a shell entity called Obsidian Blue Limited, registered in Grand Cayman. It lists the beneficial owner not as Victoria Hawthorne, but as Cassandra Hawthorne. Victoria let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. That is right, I said, looking at her cold, pale face. You used my identity. You used my social security number, which you have had since I was a child, to open offshore accounts without my knowledge. In the eyes of the law, I own this company, but I have never been to the Cayman Islands. My passport has not been stamped there. Yours, however, has. I pulled up a flight manifest. November 3rd, a private charter flight from Teterboro to Grand Cayman, passenger Victoria Hawthorne. The date coincides perfectly with the opening of this account. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this is classic identity theft utilized for the purpose of money laundering, but the mechanism of the fraud is even more cynical. I gestured to the tax return on the left side of the screen. Please look at line 21 of Schedule C, I instructed. My mother declared a loss of $2 million. She categorized the money she stole from my trust fund not as income, but as a bad debt investment loss. She claimed that she loaned this money to a failed startup, my so-called crazy projects, and that the money was lost. I paused to let the implications sink in. She stole $2 million from me, moved it into her accounts, and then told the Internal Revenue Service that she had lost that money so she could deduct it from her taxable income. She used the theft to lower her tax bill by nearly $700,000. That is a lie, Sterling shouted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He was looking at the documents on the screen with the horrified realization that he was standing next to a radioactive client. These are just accounting interpretations. Let us see how the IRS interprets it, I countered. Because the money was not lost. It was not burned. It was spent. I swiped the screen again. A property deed appeared. This is a purchase agreement for a commercial warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, bought under the name of Obsidian Blue Limited, the company she opened in my name for exactly $1.8 million. The purchase date is 3 days after she claimed the loss on her taxes. I looked at Judge Vance. She stole the money. She claimed a tax deduction for losing the money, and then she used the stolen money to buy real estate in a booming market, hiding the asset under my name so that if the company went bankrupt, the creditors couldn't touch it. It is a triple-layered wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The judge was no longer looking at the screen. He was looking at Victoria Hawthorne with an expression that was terrifyingly blank. It was the look of a man who realized his courtroom had been used as a stage for a federal crime. Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Vance said, his voice low. Did you purchase a warehouse in Red Hook using funds from the defendant's trust? Victoria stood up, her hands shaking violently. It was an investment for her future. I was holding it for her. She is too sick to manage real estate. You just said 10 minutes ago that the money was gone, I interrupted, my voice sharp. You said I wasted it. Now suddenly it is a warehouse in Brooklyn. Which is it? Mother, am I a squanderer, or are you a liar? She glared at me, her eyes wild. You ungrateful little wretch. I did this for this family. No, I said, stepping closer to the projection screen. You did not do this for the family. You did not even do this for greed. You did it for survival. I turned to the gallery. Mr. Sterling showed you a video earlier. A video of me, looking deranged, burning papers in an alleyway at 2 a.m. He told you I was destroying my own financial records. He told you I was paranoid. I keyed a command into my laptop. The video file Sterling had played earlier reappeared on the massive screen. The grainy footage showed the crazy Cassandra shivering in the cold, feeding papers into a burning trash can. Mr. Sterling was right about one thing, I said. I was terrified that night, but I wasn't terrified of the IRS, and I wasn't hallucinating. I paused the video. I engaged a digital enhancement algorithm that I used frequently in my work for the agency. The pixelated image of the paper in my hand sharpened, the contrast adjusted. The blurry white rectangle became a legible document. This is forensic video enhancement, I explained. The same technology used by the FBI to read license plates from satellite footage. Let us look at what I was actually burning. I zoomed in on the paper. The text was handwritten in thick, aggressive black marker. It was not a bank statement. It was not a stock certificate. It was a note. VH, 2 weeks late, 500K, or we take the kneecaps, the Russian. The entire courtroom gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the room. I zoomed in on another piece of paper in the burning pile. Final notice. Collateral will be seized. No police. I turned to face my mother. She had collapsed back into her chair, her face the color of ash. She looked like a ghost. Blackmail, I said, the word hanging heavy in the air. Extortion. That is what this is about. My mother is not a successful tycoon. V-Style Corporation has been insolvent for 5 years. She has been keeping up appearances by borrowing money from loan sharks, illegal gambling syndicates, and the kind of private lenders who break bones when you miss a payment. I looked at the judge. The night I was burning those papers, I had found them hidden in the lining of her vintage coat. She had been hiding them from me. She didn't want me to know that our lives were in danger. I burned them because I was trying to protect her. I thought if I destroyed the threats, maybe they would go away. I was naive. I was playing the role of the scared daughter. But the fear you see in that video, that was real. I wasn't scared of demons. I was scared of the men waiting in a black SUV outside our building. This entire court case, I continued, my voice rising with righteous anger. This conservatorship, this attempt to label me as insane, it is not about medical care. It is a desperate grab for assets. She needs control of my remaining money. And she needs the title to the apartment, not to invest, but to pay off a gambling debt that is currently sitting at $3 million. I pulled up one final graphic. It was a dossier from a private investigator, a real one, not the hack she had hired. These are records from the Obsidian Club, an illegal high-stakes poker room in Atlantic City, I said. Victoria Hawthorne is a VIP member. In the last year alone, she has lost $1.2 million at the tables. The $2 million she stole from me. It didn't go to consulting. It went to cover her losses so the mob wouldn't burn down her store. Victoria let out a scream. It was a primal, ugly sound. She leaped to her feet, knocking her chair over with a loud clatter. "You liar!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You vicious, ungrateful liar! I am your mother. I gave you life. How dare you shaming me like this? How dare you expose our private business to these people? It ceased to be private business when you forged my signature and dragged me before a Supreme Court judge," I shouted back, matching her volume for the first time. "It ceased to be private when you tried to have me locked in a padded cell so you could gamble away the roof over my head. I did it for you," she wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "I needed to win it back, one big hand. Cassandra, just one big win, and I would have put it all back. I would have doubled your trust fund. I was trying to save us." The confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. She had admitted it. She wasn't denying the gambling. She wasn't denying the theft. She was justifying it with the twisted logic of an addict. Judge Vance slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "Order!" he roared. "Mrs. Hawthorne, sit down and be silent immediately, or I will have you gagged." But the damage was done. The facade of the elegant CEO was gone. Standing there was a desperate, broken addict who had cannibalized her own child to feed her vice. Judge Vance looked at her, and the look of hesitation or pity that had been there at the start of the trial was completely gone. In its place was a look of profound disgust and simmering anger. He had been manipulated. He had almost signed a court order that would have made him an accessory to a felony. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice dangerously calm, "I assume you were unaware that your client's business losses were actually gambling debts to organized crime." Sterling was pale, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked like he was about to vomit. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this. I was provided with sanitized financials. I am withdrawing my representation effectively immediately." "You can't withdraw," Victoria screamed, grabbing his arm. "You work for me. Fix this." Sterling shook her off as if she were contagious. Get away from me. Victoria, I'm not going to prison for you. I stood in the center of the storm I had created, feeling a strange sense of calm. The mentally unstable girl was gone. The evidence had spoken, and it had screamed. Your Honor, I said quietly, drawing the judge's attention back to me. My mother is not the plaintiff here. She is the perpetrator, and I am asking the court to recognize that the danger in this room does not come from me. Judge Vance looked at me, then at the sobbing wreck of a woman on the other side of the aisle. He took a deep breath, adjusting his robes. The court recognizes the evidence, Vance said, and the court is appalled. Mr. Sterling was a man drowning in the middle of the ocean, and he had just decided that his only hope for survival was to cling to a burning piece of driftwood. The revelation of the gambling debts had sucked the oxygen out of the room, leaving his client exposed as a desperate addict. But Sterling was expensive for a reason. He possessed the cockroach-like ability to survive a nuclear blast. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, looked at the judge, and then pointed a shaking finger at the document still lying on the bench, the mortgage authorization. "This is character assassination?" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking. "So what if Mrs. Hawthorne has recreational habits? That is irrelevant to the law. The fact remains that Cassandra Hawthorne signed that document. The signature is there. It matches her driver's license. It matches her passport. You cannot argue with ink on paper." He turned to me, his eyes wide and manic. "You admitted the signature looks real because it is real. You signed it during a lucid moment, and now you are using your mother's personal struggles to void a legal contract. That is the real fraud here." Judge Vance looked at the document again. The doubt was creeping back in. The law loved paper. It loved signatures. It understood them better than it understood server logs or digital honeypots. If the signature was genuine, then technically, I had authorized the loan, regardless of where the money eventually went. "He has a point, Miss Hawthorne," Judge Vance said, though his tone was far less accommodating than before. "If you signed this, you authorized the mortgage. The use of funds is a separate civil matter. The validity of the lien stands or falls on this signature." I stood perfectly still. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. It was the smile of a hunter who watches the prey run directly into the pit trap. "Mr. Sterling is right about one thing," I said, my voice smooth and deadly calm. "One should not argue with ink on paper, but one should definitely argue when there is no ink involved." "What are you talking about?" Sterling snapped. "It is right there in black and blue." "Is it?" I asked. I turned back to my terminal. "Your Honor, I mentioned earlier that my specialty is forensic auditing, but before I hunted money, I hunted forgeries. I spent 3 years working as a consultant for the FBI's Question Documents Unit. I know the difference between a human hand and a machine." I typed a command. The projector screen shifted. The image of the signature that I had displayed earlier was now replaced by a microscopic close-up. It was zoomed in 500%. "This is a spectral analysis of the signature on the document Mr. Sterling just submitted," I explained. I took the liberty of scanning it with the high-resolution macro lens on my tablet while I was standing at the bench 10 minutes ago. I pointed to the jagged edge of the letter C in my name. "When a person writes with a ballpoint or fountain pen," I lectured, slipping into the professorial tone I used when briefing federal agents, "the ink is a liquid. It flows. It soaks into the fibers of the paper. Under magnification, you see bleeding at the edges. You see variations in density. You see the gooping where the ball of the pen changes direction." I tapped the screen. "Now, look at this." The image showed the black line of the signature, but it wasn't a solid fluid line. It was composed of thousands of tiny, distinct black dots fused onto the surface of the paper. "This is not liquid ink," I declared. "This is toner, carbon black mixed with a polymer, melted onto the paper by a fuser unit heated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a laser print." The courtroom was silent. "What you are looking at is a high-quality simulation," I continued. Someone took a scan of my real signature, likely from an old birthday card or a tax form, and used an AutoPen machine or a high-resolution laser printer to superimpose it onto this mortgage authorization. It sits on top of the paper fibers. It does not soak in. I looked at Sterling. You are holding a photocopy, Mr. Sterling. A very expensive, very illegal forgery. That could be a scanning error, Sterling stammered, grasping at straws. Or maybe she used a felt-tip pen that looks like toner. A felt-tip pen does not leave a matrix of half-toning dots, I countered instantly. But if the physics of the ink does not convince you, perhaps the physics of time will. I swiped the screen. A new document appeared. It was a hospital admission record, stamped with the seal of Mount Sinai Hospital. Please look at the date on the mortgage authorization, I said. October 12th. The timestamp next to the signature says the document was signed at 2:30 in the afternoon. I pointed to the hospital record. On October 12th, at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. I was not in a lawyer's office signing away my grandmother's apartment. I was in operating room 4 at Mount Sinai. Undergoing an emergency appendectomy, I zoomed in on the anesthesia log. Here is the chart. Anesthesia administered at 2:15. Surgery commenced at 2:30. I was unconscious, intubated, and cut open at the exact moment my mother claims I was signing this document. I turned to Victoria. She was gripping the table, her fingernails digging into the wood. She looked like she was going to be sick. Unless I learned how to sign legal documents while under general anesthesia and physically located 5 miles away from the notary public, I said, my voice dripping with ice. This document is a fabrication, and since it was used to secure a bank loan, that makes it bank fraud, a federal crime punishable by up to 30 years in prison. Judge Vance looked at the document on his bench as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. He pushed it away with the tip of his pen. Mr. Sterling, Vance said, his voice thundering. You have submitted a forged instrument to this court. You have attempted to enforce a fraudulent lien. I didn't know, Sterling squeaked, backing away from the table. I swear. Your Honor, she gave it to me. She told me it was real. He pointed at Victoria, throwing her under the bus with zero hesitation. But I was not done. The forgery was the shield. I still had to use the sword. The fraud is proven, I said, stepping away from the screen. The mortgage is invalid. The conservatorship is dead. But there is one loose end that we need to tie up. I walked toward the gallery, stopping just a few feet from where Victoria sat. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and terror. She knew the game was over. But she didn't realize that I wasn't just ending the game. I was taking the board home. You took out a loan against the apartment, I said to her. Using that fake signature, you borrowed $1.5 million. Victoria swallowed hard, finding her voice. I will pay it back. I will sell the inventory. I will fix it. You can't pay it back, I said simply. You are broke. We established that with the gambling records. But here's the interesting part. Mother, the bank you borrowed from, the first merchant lender of New York. Did you ever wonder why they approved the loan so quickly? Did you ever wonder why they didn't ask too many questions about the signature? Victoria frowned. They are a private equity firm. They take risks. They are a shark lender, I corrected. They specialize in distressed assets, high interest, predatory terms, exactly the kind of place a desperate woman goes when legitimate banks say no. I walked back to my laptop. 2 years ago, when I realized you were spiraling, I knew you would eventually try to leverage the real estate, I said. I knew you would try to mortgage the apartment. I couldn't stop you from trying, but I could control who you owed. I typed a final command. The screen displayed a corporate acquisition document. Last year, First Merchant Lender was acquired by a holding company called Argus Holdings. It was a quiet buyout, distressed debt purchase, pennies on the dollar. I turned to Victoria, leaning in close so she could see the truth in my eyes. Mother, I said softly, I am the CEO of Argus Holdings. Victoria's jaw dropped. Her eyes bulged. What? I use the profits from my cryptocurrency trading and my forensic consulting work. I explained. I set up Argus Holdings, and then, methodically, over the last 18 months, I bought your debt. I gestured to the screen. A list of promissory notes scrolled by. I bought the mortgage on the apartment. I bought the business loans for V-Style. I even bought the personal promissory notes you signed to those investors in Atlantic City. I bought them all. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She slumped back in her chair, all the fight draining out of her. You own me, she whispered. I own the roof over your head, I said. I own the company you claim is yours. I own the debt that you were trying to pay off by stealing from me. You didn't borrow from a bank, Victoria. You borrowed from the daughter you called a failure. I looked at Judge Vance. So, Your Honor, I said, the irony is that she is asking for a conservatorship to manage my money, but in reality, I am already managing hers. I am her biggest creditor, and as of this morning, she is in default on all 3 loans. You set me up, Victoria hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You planned this. You let me dig this hole. I didn't hand you the shovel. Mother, I replied coldly. I just stood back and watched you dig. I watched you forge my name. I watched you steal my trust fund. I watched you lie to this court. I gave you every opportunity to stop. I waited. I waited for you to come to me and ask for help. I waited for you to be a mother. I paused, my voice cracking slightly, the only emotion I allowed myself to show. But you didn't come to me for help. You came for my blood. You came to have me declared insane so you could keep digging. I straightened up, locking away the hurt and returning to the cold. Hard facts. The smoking gun isn't the forgery. Mother, I said, the smoking gun is the fact that you are sitting in a courtroom trying to destroy the only person who actually owns the chaotic mess you call a life. I turned to the judge. Argus Holdings is exercising its right to call the loans due to fraud and default. We will be moving to seize the assets of V-Style Corporation and all personal collateral put up by Victoria Hawthorne, which means, effectively immediately, she has no company, no income, and no home. The silence in the courtroom was total. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the top of its arc, waiting to drop. Victoria looked around the room. She saw the disgust on the faces of the gallery. She saw Sterling backing away from her. She saw the judge looking at her like she was a criminal. And she saw me, the daughter she had mocked and belittled, holding the keys to her entire existence. She didn't scream this time. She didn't cry. She simply collapsed. It wasn't a faint. It was a surrender. She slid down in her chair, looking small, old, and incredibly defeated. I think we are done here, I said, closing my laptop with a definitive snap. Judge Vance let out a long breath. He looked at the paperwork in front of him, the petition for conservatorship, and tore it in half. The sound of the ripping paper echoed in the quiet room. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice flat. Consider the petition denied with prejudice, and I suggest you do not leave the building. The bailiff will be calling the district attorney's office regarding the forged documents. Sterling nodded frantically, looking like he wanted to crawl under the table. And Mrs. Hawthorne, the judge added, looking at the heap of a woman in the front row. I believe you have some eviction notices to deal with. I picked up my bag. I didn't look back at her. The trap had sprung. The evidence had spoken. The mentally unstable girl had just executed the most hostile takeover in the history of family court, and I was just getting started with the cleanup. The courtroom was thick with the stunned silence that follows a public execution. Victoria Hawthorne lay slumped in her chair, a heap of defeated couture, while her lawyer, Mr. Sterling, frantically stuffed papers into his briefcase with the jerky movements of a cornered rat. Judge Vance had torn up the conservatorship petition. The gallery was whispering. By all traditional metrics, the battle was over. I had won. I had kept my freedom, my money, and my dignity. But I was not here for a victory lap. I was here for a funeral. Judge Vance cleared his throat, reaching for his gavel to dismiss the session. If there are no further motions, he began, his voice weary. This court is adjourned, Mrs. Hawthorne. I suggest you— Your Honor, I interrupted. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonance that stopped the judge mid-sentence. I am afraid we are not finished. Vance paused, his gavel hovering inches above the mahogany. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. Miss Hawthorne, you have successfully defended yourself against the petition. The mortgage is invalid. You are free to go. What else could there possibly be? I stood rooted to the spot in the center of the room. I did not look at my mother. I looked straight at the bench, my expression carved from granite. I did not come here today simply to defend myself, I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Defense implies that I was merely reacting to an attack. But as I demonstrated with the honeypot, I do not react. I orchestrate. I took a step forward. I came here to deliver a package, and I came here to ensure the recipient was present to sign for it. A package? Vance asked, his brow furrowing. Evidence, Your Honor, I corrected. Criminally actionable evidence. Victoria stirred in her chair. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and wary. She thought the worst had passed. She thought she was facing bankruptcy and humiliation. She had no concept of the precipice upon which she teetered. You asked earlier why I let the theft continue, I said, turning slightly to address the room while keeping my eyes on the judge. You asked why I watched my mother transfer $10,000, then $50,000, then $100,000 without intervening. You thought it was passivity. You thought it was fear. I shook my head slowly. It was statutory mathematics. I walked back to my laptop and tapped a single key. The screen behind the judge changed one last time. It displayed the seal of the United States Department of Justice, alongside a citation of the United States Code. Under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, I recited from memory, the statutes rolling off my tongue like scripture. Wire fraud is defined as devising a scheme to defraud or obtain money by false pretenses, utilizing interstate electronic communications. However, the severity of the sentencing guidelines depends heavily on the amount stolen and the complexity of the scheme. I pointed to the red total on the screen, $2,040,000. If I had stopped my mother at $50,000, I explained, my voice cold and clinical, it would have been a state-level civil dispute, a family matter. She would have received a slap on the wrist, perhaps probation. She would have cried to a sympathetic judge about her difficult daughter, and she would have walked free to steal from someone else. I paused, letting the weight of the logic settle on the room. That was unacceptable to me, I said. So, I waited. Victoria sat up straighter, horror dawning on her face. She began to realize that my silence over the last year had not been the silence of a victim, but the silence of a sniper waiting for the wind to settle. I waited for the total to cross the $1 million threshold, I continued. I waited for her to move the money across state lines from New York to the servers in New Jersey and finally to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. That creates federal jurisdiction. That triggers the Interstate Commerce Clause. I turned to look at Sterling. He had stopped packing his bag. He was staring at me, his face the color of old paste. As a lawyer, he knew exactly what I was saying. And finally, I added, delivering the coup de grace, I waited for April 15th. I waited for her to file that fraudulent tax return, because while wire fraud is serious, tax evasion is the engine that drives the federal conviction machine. By claiming the stolen money as a business loss, she did not just steal from me, she stole from the United States Treasury. You let me do it, Victoria whispered. Her voice was barely audible, a rasp of disbelief. You watched me. I facilitated it, I corrected her without a shred of remorse. I left the door unlocked. I made sure the shadow account had sufficient liquidity. I gave you the rope, Mother. I just stood back and watched you tie the noose. You are a monster, she breathed, her hands clutching her chest. I am a forensic auditor, I replied. And I have completed my audit. I turned back to Judge Vance. Your Honor, the jurisdiction for these crimes does not lie in family court. It lies with the Southern District of New York, and because the defendant has significant offshore connections and access to private aircraft, she is considered a high-risk flight candidate. What are you asking for, Miss Hawthorne? Judge Vance asked quietly. I am not asking for anything, I said. I am informing you that the invitees have arrived. I looked at the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. Right on time, as if choreographed. The doors swung open with a heavy, authoritative thud. The air in the room changed instantly. The humidity of the emotional drama evaporated. Replaced by the sterile, terrifying chill of federal authority, 6 people walked in. They did not walk like lawyers. They walked like soldiers. They wore blue windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back that screamed power. 3 of them bore the letters FBI. The other 3 bore the letters IRS, CID, Criminal Investigation Division. Leading them was a woman with a sharp face and eyes like flint. I knew her. Special Agent Miller. We had collaborated on the dismantling of a crypto laundering ring 2 years ago. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at the defendant's table. The gallery erupted. People stood up, craning their necks. Aunt Martha let out a high-pitched shriek. Uncle Philip looked like he was trying to merge with the wooden bench to become invisible. All rise, the bailiff shouted, though he looked just as confused as everyone else. Special Agent Miller marched down the center aisle, her heels clicking on the floor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. She stopped in front of the bar. Federal agents, she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. We are here to execute an arrest warrant. Victoria scrambled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She looked at the agents, then at the judge, then at me. Her eyes were wide, frantic, animalistic. The reality of the situation crashed into her with the force of a freight train. This wasn't a lawsuit. This wasn't a scolding. This was the end of her life as she knew it. No, she whimpered. No, you can't. I am Victoria Hawthorne. This is a mistake. Victoria Hawthorne, Agent Miller said, stepping through the gate. She held up a document. You are under arrest for 19 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of aggravated identity theft, and 5 counts of tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. Sterling, Victoria screamed, grabbing her lawyer's arm. Do something. Tell them who I am. Sterling, however, was currently engaged in a desperate attempt to become invisible. He had backed away from the table, inching toward the side exit, his briefcase clutched to his chest. Mr. Sterling, Agent Miller said, not even turning her head. I would suggest you stay exactly where you are. We have a warrant for you as well. Sterling froze. Me, I am just legal counsel. I have attorney-client privilege. Not when you knowingly submit forged documents to a federal court, Miller replied coolly. That falls under the crime fraud exception, and we have the metadata from your office printer. 2 agents moved toward Sterling. He dropped his briefcase. His knees seemed to liquefy, and he slumped against the railing, hyperventilating. Meanwhile, 2 other agents closed in on Victoria. Panic, raw and ugly, seized my mother. She looked at the handcuffs on the agent's belt, and something in her snapped. She didn't think. She reacted. No, I will not go, she shrieked. She bolted. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt. She lunged toward the side door, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She shoved past the bailiff, her hands flailing. Secure the subject, Miller barked. It was over in seconds. An agent stepped into her path, grabbing her arm with practiced efficiency. Victoria thrashed, screaming, kicking out with her designer shoes. Get off me! Get your hands off me! She wailed. Cassandra, tell them to stop! They spun her around, pressing her against the wall. The sound of ratcheting steel cut through her screams as the handcuffs clicked into place. Cassandra! She screamed again, turning her head to look at me. Her hair was wild, falling across her face. Her mascara was smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. Help me, I am your mother. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I watched the scene with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction that had reached its predicted conclusion. Cassandra sent us the dossier 24 hours ago. Mrs. Hawthorne, Agent Miller said as she read Victoria her rights. This entire hearing was just a way to keep you in the jurisdiction until we could finalize the warrant. Victoria stopped struggling. She went rigid. She looked at me across the room, and the realization hit her. I hadn't just defeated her, I had served her up on a silver platter. The look on her face shifted from fear to pure, unadulterated venom. The mask of the victim fell away completely, revealing the narcissist beneath. "You bitch!" she screamed, straining against the cuffs. Spittle flew from her lips. "You ungrateful, poisonous snake. I gave you everything. I put clothes on your back. I fed you, and this is how you repay me. You sell your own mother to the wolves." The agents began to drag her toward the door. She dug her heels in, fighting every step. "You are nothing without me," she roared, her voice cracking. "You are a sad, lonely, crazy girl. You will die alone. You hear me? You are rotted inside." The gallery watched in horror. This was the woman who, an hour ago, had been weeping into a silk handkerchief about her love for her child. Now, she was spitting curses that would make a sailor blush. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I walked slowly toward the aisle, stopping just as the agents were dragging her past me. I signaled for them to pause. Agent Miller nodded, holding Victoria firmly. My mother was breathing hard, her chest heaving. Her eyes were burning holes into mine. "Look at you," she spat. "You think you won? You are just a traitor. A crazy traitor." I leaned in close, so close I could smell the expensive perfume she had bought with my money. I looked deep into her eyes, searching for any trace of the mother I had yearned for as a child. I found nothing but greed and rage. "You spent my entire life telling me I was broken," I said softly. My voice was steady, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. "You told me I couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. You told me I was weak." I straightened up, looking down at her. "But I'm not crazy, Mother," I said, delivering the final verdict. "I am just too sane to be tricked by you anymore." I nodded to Agent Miller. "Take her." "Move," the agent ordered. They hauled her away. Victoria resumed her screaming, but her voice faded as they pushed her through the double doors and out into the hallway. Sterling was led out behind her, weeping softly into his hands, a broken man. The doors swung shut, sealing the noise outside. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. The energy in the room had shifted from high-voltage tension to a strange, hollow vacuum. I turned back to the bench. Judge Vance was still standing, his hands resting on his desk. He looked at the empty space where the defendants had been. Then he looked at me. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice quiet. "In all my years on the bench, I have never seen anything like that." "I apologize for the theatrics, Your Honor," I said, picking up my leather bag. "But as you saw, my mother is a woman who requires a very specific kind of closure." "The dossier you sent to the FBI?" Vance asked. "It contained everything," I confirmed. "Every bank transfer, every forged document, every email. The case is ironclad. She will not be eligible for bail." I looked around the room. My Aunt Martha was staring at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. Uncle Philip was gone. He must have slipped out during the chaos, likely to call his own lawyer before the IRS came knocking on his door. I was alone, but for the first time in 32 years, being alone didn't feel like isolation. It felt like liberation. "You are free to go, Miss Hawthorne," Judge Vance said. He sounded exhausted. "Godspeed." "Thank you, Your Honor." I turned and walked down the aisle. I walked past the empty witness stand where Mark had lied about me. I walked past the table where Sterling had tried to bury me. I walked past the gallery where my family had judged me. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the hallway. The agents were gone. The screaming had stopped. It was done. The cage was broken. The predator was captured. I walked toward the exit of the courthouse, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, moving toward the sunlight that was streaming through the glass doors at the end of the hall. The nightmare was over. Now, I just had to figure out what to do with the waking world. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the chaotic sounds of my mother's screaming in the hallway. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and ringing with the aftershocks of the confrontation. It was the kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when the last cannon has fired and the smoke begins to clear. I stood in the center of the aisle, my posture relaxed for the first time in 3 years. My shoulders dropped. The tension that had lived in my jaw, grinding my teeth at night, evaporated. I turned slowly to look at the gallery. The rows of benches were mostly empty now, save for 2 figures who looked like they were trying to shrink into the wood grain. My Aunt Martha and Uncle Philip. 10 minutes ago, they had been sitting tall, exchanging smug whispers and judgmental glances, eagerly awaiting the moment I would be dragged off to a facility so they could help Victoria pick over the carcass of my inheritance. Now, they looked like children caught in a thunderstorm without an umbrella. Martha was clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles were white, and Philip was staring steadfastly at his shoes, refusing to make eye contact. I walked toward them. The sound of my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor made Martha flinch. I stopped at the railing, looking down at them. I didn't say anything at first. I just let them sit in the discomfort. I let them remember every snide comment they had made at Thanksgiving, every time they had called me troubled or slow behind my back while drinking my grandmother's wine. "Martha," I said softly. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She was afraid. She had just watched me dismantle her sister with surgical precision, and she knew she had been complicit. She was terrified that I had a dossier on her too. She was terrified that I knew about her shoplifting habit or her husband's tax shelters. She stammered, her voice trembling. "Cassandra, we didn't know. We truly didn't know she was stealing. We thought she was trying to help you." "Save it," I said, my voice cool and devoid of anger. "I don't care what you thought, but I want you to listen to me very carefully." I leaned in closer. "Victoria is going to prison. She is facing at least 15 years for federal wire fraud and tax evasion. Her assets are gone. Her reputation is ash. She will die in a cell." Philip made a small, choking sound. "I am not going to come after you," I continued, watching the relief wash over them. "You are not predators. You are just scavengers, and scavengers are not worth the cost of the ammunition." I straightened up. "But if I ever hear my name in your mouths again, or if I ever see you near my property, I will reconsider my position. Do we understand each other?" "Yes," Martha whispered, nodding frantically. "Yes, Cassandra. We understand." Good. I turned my back on them, dismissing them from my life forever. They were no longer family. They were just ghosts of a past I was leaving behind. I walked back to the bench. Judge Vance was still standing there, organizing his papers. He looked up as I approached. The stern, intimidating figure of the law looked human, tired, and deeply apologetic. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Your Honor." I nodded. "I want to formally apologize," Judge Vance said, and his voice was sincere. "This court is designed to protect the vulnerable. Today, we almost became an instrument of their oppression. I am sorry that you had to go to such extreme lengths to prove your sanity." "It was necessary," I replied. "My mother is a master manipulator. She would have charmed a jury just as easily as she charmed her investors. I needed to show you the monster underneath the makeup." "You did more than that," Vance said, signing a final order. "I am dismissing the petition for conservatorship with prejudice. I am also expunging the record of these proceedings to ensure this does not affect your professional standing. You are a free woman, Cassandra, in every sense of the word." "Thank you, Judge." I picked up my leather bag, the one that held the laptop that had saved my life. I walked down the center aisle, past the empty defense table, past the spot where Sterling had cried, and pushed open the doors. I stepped out into the hallway. It was empty. The agents had already taken Victoria down the secure elevator to the holding cells. She was gone. The air in the corridor felt lighter, cleaner. I walked to the main exit of the Supreme Court building. I pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out onto the wide stone steps. The air of New York City hit me. It was crisp, cold, and smelled of exhaust and roasted nuts. Above me, the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. Without a single cloud to mar the expanse, it was the kind of day that made you believe in new beginnings. I stood there for a moment, closing my eyes, letting the sun warm my face. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with oxygen that finally felt like it belonged to me. I checked my internal emotional state. I expected to feel sad. After all, I had just sent my own mother to federal prison. I expected to feel a sense of loss, a mourning for the relationship that could have been, but there was nothing. No sadness, no guilt, no regret. I felt lightweight. It was the specific physical sensation of having a heavy, malignant tumor surgically removed from your body. The pain was gone. The toxic drain on my energy was severed. I felt a profound, quiet peace settling into my bones. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. Not the burner phone I used for the paranoid daughter act, but my encrypted satellite phone. I dialed a number. It rang once. "Hawthorne here," I said. "Miss Hawthorne?" The voice of my chief of operations at Obsidian Analytics answered. "We were monitoring the situation. Is the asset secure?" "The asset is in federal custody," I said, walking down the steps. "The operation was a complete success. Now, I want to initiate the secondary phase. The V-Style acquisition. Execute it," I ordered. Argus Holdings is to exercise the default clauses on the business loans immediately. We are taking possession of the company by close of business today. "Understood," the assistant said. "Do you want us to try and restructure? The brand name still has some recognition. We could potentially turn a profit if we pivot to online retail." I stopped on the sidewalk. A pigeon fluttered near my feet. "No," I said firmly. "We are not saving it. I want you to liquidate everything. Sell the inventory to discount wholesalers. Sell the trademark. Sell the office furniture. I want every single dollar squeezed out of that corpse. And the proceeds. Use the proceeds to pay the employees," I said. "I know for a fact she hasn't paid the design team or the warehouse staff in 3 months. Make them whole. Give them severance packages. Pay off the legitimate vendors who were cheated. And then, once the debts are cleared, I want you to dissolve the corporation. Dissolve it. Burn it down," I said. "I want V-Style to cease to exist. I want the sign taken down. I want the website scrubbed. I am erasing her legacy. By the time we are done, it will be like Victoria Hawthorne never sold a single dress." "Understood. Ms. Hawthorne, we are moving on it now." "Good work." I hung up the phone. It was the final act of justice. Victoria cared about 2 things: her money and her name. I had taken the money. Now, I was erasing the name. I walked toward the curb. A sleek black sedan pulled up silently. It was a Maybach, its polished surface reflecting the city skyline. It was a car that cost more than the apartment I had fought to keep. The driver, a large man named Silas, who had been with me since I started Obsidian, stepped out and opened the rear door. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hawthorne," he said, his face impassive. "Where to?" "The airport. Silas," I said, sliding into the soft leather interior. "I have a meeting in Zurich tomorrow morning." "And the trial?" he asked, closing the door and getting into the driver's seat. "Case closed," I replied. The car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the chaotic traffic of Manhattan. I looked out the tinted window, watching the courthouse recede into the distance. It looked like a tomb now, a monument to a dead life. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small compact mirror and a tube of lipstick. It was a deep, blood-red shade. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror. The girl in the gray sweater, with the messy hair and the frightened eyes, was gone. She had served her purpose. She had been the perfect bait. I wiped the smudge of stress makeup from under my eyes. I applied the red lipstick with steady, precise strokes. I smoothed my hair back. The eyes staring back at me were sharp, intelligent, and dangerous. They were the eyes of the ghost auditor. They were the eyes of a woman who had walked through fire and come out holding the match. I snapped the compact shut. My mother had spent her life playing games. She played with money, she played with the law, and she played with people. She thought she was the queen of the board. She never realized that I was the one designing the game. She would have 15 years in a federal cell to think about that. 15 years to wonder how the crazy daughter managed to outmaneuver her at every turn. I settled back into the seat, watching the city fly by. I was 32 years old. I was wealthy. I was free. And for the first time, the silence in my head wasn't a defense mechanism. It was peace. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. They say you should wait, be patient, and let karma do the work. But as the car accelerated onto the highway, putting distance between me and the wreckage of my family, I realized that the old saying was wrong. Revenge is not just a dish, it is a business transaction. And like any good business transaction, it requires preparation, leverage, and the absolute willingness to close the deal. I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I think revenge is best when you own the restaurant and kick the bad patrons out. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Cassandra and her fight for justice. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below with your country or city. Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more stories of revenge and justice, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, Blue Payback. Hit that like button to support us, and smash the hype button to help this story get recommended to more people. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe, and see you in the next story.